All right, everybody, welcome back to Contemporary American Literature. We're continuing our look at the confessional poets of the 50s and 60s, and we've come now to the most famous of the confessional poets, one of the most famous and celebrated and well-known of American poets of any period, Sylvia Plath. Sylvia Plath, who is as well known in some ways for her life as for her art, and I'm just going to give you a brief biography of Plath, and then I want to look at one of a part of one of her most famous poems, and then I want to look at her most famous poem in its entirety and talk a little bit about it. So Plath was born in 1932 in Boston, and she had a German father who was a biologist. I think he wrote even a book on bees, and he was a professor of biology. But he died quite young from diabetes when she was 8 years old, and so she was mostly raised by her mother, Aurelia. And then she attended Smith College on a scholarship and began to write poetry and fiction. And also a little later, she did study poetry with Robert Lowell himself. And so she often credited the example of Robert Lowell's poetry after life studies in inspiring her to write the poetry that would come to be called confessional, poetry that was about her life and her experiences, particularly as she, like Lowell, experienced mental illness throughout her life, suffered from depression and other mental illnesses throughout her life, which included several suicide attempts, including one when she was in college, and several forms of treatment, such as electroconvulsive therapy, that were seemingly not quite effective at the time. So she was one of the things we've come back to in this class. We talked about it in terms of Tennessee Williams' sister, who received a lobotomy, which was a actual severing of nerves in the brain to try to treat mental illness. Mental illness is something that, the treatment of it has changed a lot over the last 100 years and gone through various, things from pharmaceutical interventions to surgical interventions to simply what Freud and Jung proposed, which was, psychological talk therapy. So this is something actually we're probably going to keep our eye on in this course, is how concepts of what mental health is have changed, because that's not something that's stable. The idea of what makes somebody mentally healthy or mentally unwell is something that changes over time. And then if a person is judged to be mentally unwell, what the treatments are and how that changes over time. And in Plath's case, it appears that a treatment that was sort of permanently affected was never fully found. She had a famously calamitous marriage to the English poet Ted Hughes. She married him in 1956, and she moved to England with him and had 2 children there. And they had a very stormy marriage, and he not helped by his infidelity. And their marriage broke up toward the end of Plath's life, and she went to live by herself with the 2 children. And it was in those circumstances in 1963, during a very bleak and very cold winter in England, that she kills herself by putting her head in a gas oven. And the poems that would make her famous, she had published some poems as well as a novel in her lifetime, but the poems that really made her famous were the ones that she wrote in the last weeks of her life and that were published after her death by Ted Hughes, who did a little bit of redacting and editing, which proved controversial as well, in a volume called Ariel in 1965. So this volume, Ariel, was published in 1965, and it contained the poems that really made Plath one of the most famous American poets, particularly Lady Lazarus and Daddy, which we're going to be looking at today. So while she saw some literary fame and success during her lifetime, she didn't, I think, live to experience the height of fame to which she would be led. But it was also not only due to her writing, but due to her life. Her life itself was an object and remains an object of interest to readers. She almost became symbolic of a female writer who was, in many ways, the kind of victim of that 50s ideology of marriage, child rearing, motherhood, conformity, a certain restrictive sense of mental health with a corresponding ineffectuality in treating it, particularly female patients. She was the figure of this repressed 50s woman whose poetry, which she writes in private in the off hours when she's not mothering her children, expresses the volcanic rage and anger and power of the female figure that is being suppressed by this patriarchal dominant order. And this is how Sylvia Plath has been read by feminist critics throughout her life. And that's why poems like Lady Lazarus and Daddy, in which Plath presents herself as this sort of voice of rage and an almost goddess-like figure of a kind of violated goddess who rises up to judge the culture that has suppressed her. That's why that's such a compelling and such a commanding image. But the little bio in the Norton Anthology notes that this is a very traditionally American way to write, that the American heroic individual ego confronting the sublime, these kind of vast universal forces. And Plath's revision of this is to turn this great self into a heroine instead of a hero, because it had been a kind of traditionally masculine figure of Walt Whitman or Ralph Waldo Emerson in 19th century poetry. This kind of grand ego has always been associated with the male poet, and Plath appropriates it for the female voice in a way that had not quite been done even by brilliant American female poets like Emily Dickinson or Marianne Moore or Elizabeth Bishop before. And so, as they say, seizing a mythic power, the Plath of the poems transmutes the domestic and the ordinary into the hallucinatory, the utterly strange. Her revision of the romantic ego dramatizes its tendency toward disproportion and excess, and she is fully capable of both using and mocking her heightened sense of self, as she does in her poem Lady Lazarus. And what they mean by mocking is that the poems are so overstated, so operatic in the poet's sense of self, that there is a kind of comic aspect to them, a kind of dimension of irony, where the poet seems to know she's almost going too far. And I think that's clear at the end of Lady Lazarus with its brilliant conclusion. So this is a poem about Plath. The autobiographical roots of this poem are Plath's suicide attempts throughout her life. I think it begins, I've done it again. And she's sort of mocking and taunting the male doctors who would cure her. Herr Doktor. The enemy for her is always German, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And she's sort of mocking and taunting this doctor that would cure her. And I think we're in the same position we were in with Robert Lowell, as we discussed with his poem Home After 3 Months Away, where there's this double sense that mental illness is both the calamity that threatens the life of the poet, but is also painfully and obscurely tied up with the poet's poetic gift. And so mental illness is a threat, but its being cured is experienced as a threat as well, because there's a fear that if you cure the disorder of the personality, will you not get rid of the personality? And again, I want you to think about some of the treatments that were being done, like lobotomy, like an actual severing of part of the brain in the mid-20th century. So there's this double, painful double sense. And what Lady Lazarus, and the very title is a kind of, that she associates herself with Lazarus, this biblical figure who comes back from the dead. She is the Lady Lazarus. And she sort of takes on this persona of this resurrected, avenging figure. And the poem ends with this almost curse: ash, ash, you poke and stir, flesh, bone, there is nothing there. A cake of soap, a wedding ring, a gold filling. Hair God, hair Lucifer, beware, beware. Out of the ash I rise with my red hair, and I eat men like air. This avenging goddess of destruction who rises out of her suicide attempts, who rises from the dead to curse the male authority, the male establishment, whether God or Lucifer is all the same to her. She's beyond good and evil either way, but she is going to rise up and transcend and be above this institution that hangs above her. And that comes out more clearly in its autobiographical sources in the most famous and problematic and controversial of her poems, Daddy, which is a poem in which the speaker addresses her father, who is clearly Plath's father, Otto Plath, who is a sort of imperious, possibly abusive German man. And the sort of central metaphor of the poem is that she compares her father's authority over her to Nazism, because, you know, this kind of, he was he German or Austrian? I guess he was Austrian, as Hitler was. And so the idea is that the German language becomes this sign of oppressive patriarchal authority. And then, as we'll see, the ethical problem comes in with the other part of that metaphor, which is that she becomes analogous to the victims of Nazism. And so she, though an ethnically German American who had a very she didn't live during a genocide to which she was subject, but she compares herself to Jewish and Roma victims of Nazism. And I want to talk about the troubling ethical questions of that gesture when I read the poem. But the thing about poetry is you have to read it aloud as much as you can to understand it. Is, you know, prose you can often just read silently, read in your head, but poetry you have to hear. And so I want to read the whole poem, and then I want to make a few remarks. So, Daddy by Sylvia Plath. You do not do anymore. Sorry, I misspoke already. I'll start again. Daddy by Sylvia Plath. You do not do anymore, black shoe, in which I have lived like a foot for 30 years, poor and white, barely daring to breathe or a chew. Daddy, I have had to kill you. You died before I had time. Marble heavy, a bag full of God, ghastly statue with one gray toe big as a Frisco seal, and a head in the freakish Atlantic, where it pours bean green over blue in the waters of beautiful Nauset. I used to pray to recover you, ach du, in the German language, in the Polish town, scraped flat by the roller of wars, but the name of the town is common. My Polack friend says there are a dozen or two, so I never could tell where you put your foot, your root. I never could talk to you. The tongue stuck in my jaw. It's stuck in a barbed wire snare. Ick, 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 ick. I could hardly speak. I thought every German was you, and the language obscene. An engine chuffing me off like a Jew to Dachau, Auschwitz, Belsen. I began to talk like a Jew. I think I may well be a Jew. The snows of the Tyrol, the clear beer of Vienna are not very pure or true. With my gypsy ancestress and my weird luck and my tarot pack, I may be a bit of a Jew. I have always been scared of you, with your Luftwaffe, your gobbledygoo, and your neat mustache, and your Aryan eye, bright blue. Panzerman, oh you, not God, but a swastika, so black no sky could squeak through. Every woman adores a fascist, the boot in the face, the brute heart of a brute like you. You stand at the blackboard, Daddy, in the picture I have of you, a cleft in your chin instead of your foot, but no less a devil for that, no, not any less the black man who bit my pretty red heart in two. I was 10 when they buried you. At 20 I tried to die and get back to you. I thought even the bones would do, but they pulled me out of the sack and they stuck me together with glue, and then I knew what to do. I made a model of you, a man in black with a Mein Kampf look and a love of the rack and the screw, and I said I do. So, Daddy, I'm finally through. The black telephone's off at the root. The voices just can't worm through. If I've killed one man, I've killed two. The vampire who said he was you and drank my blood for a year. 7 years, if you want to know. Daddy, you can lie back now. There's a stake in your fat black heart, and the villagers never liked you. They are dancing and stamping on you. They always knew it was you. Daddy, you bastard, I'm through. So, that's a very powerful poem, whatever we judge of it ethically and politically. And the essence of the poem is an accusation against the father. And it's an accusation that he was imperious, he was domineering, that he dominated her life, but also that he died before she could in some way make peace with him, with their relationship, before she could find, to use a later psychological vocabulary, closure in their relationship. And so she's left with this analogy that she makes between her father and the Nazis and herself and the victims of the Nazis. She says, I think I may well be a Jew. She talks about her gypsy ancestress, and she says, I may be a bit of a Jew. And I think this goes together with that interest in the outsider, that people like Sylvia Plath and Robert Lowell, who in some ways belonged to the sort of white middle-class culture, but who felt themselves very alienated from it, identified themselves in ways that we're no doubt now going to find quite problematic with people who were oppressed by that dominant culture on the basis of race, ethnicity, or religion. So you have Plath identifying herself with Jewish people. We're going to see John Barrowman writing poems in African American vernacular English. So there's this almost this desire on the part of these white middle-class poets to identify the sense of outsider status that they feel from the community to which they belong by making that literal, by trying to identify themselves with people who are outsiders on the basis of racism, of anti-Semitism. And so that's the troubling gesture. Now, one of the things that makes this poem powerful, though, is the way it's written. So you have, it's mostly free verse, but you have one rhyme that comes back, but it comes back irregularly. So you never know it's that ooh sound, do, shoe, a chew, you, blue. There's almost one in every stanza with a couple exceptions. You know it's going to come back, but you don't know when. And so the sound ties the poem together, but it's also unsettling and disorienting to read. And so you feel the kind of unsettlement she feels, that you almost like her attacks of mental illness. The rhyme comes back, but you can't know when to expect it, and it catches you unawares, and it takes you by surprise. And we shouldn't neglect, we can talk about and we are going to talk more, I have another slide about the problematic sort of racial or ethnic discourse of the poem, but as a testament to what was not yet a feminist movement, this poem has been taken as inspirational, as a kind of young woman speaking back to oppressive, dominant, patriarchal male authority. And so we can sense the burgeoning of what will arise in the late 60s as a full-fledged feminist movement. And we'll talk about feminism and its history when we get there. But I think this poem signals that is coming, that that's on the way, that that's inevitable, that there's this sense of repression and oppression that even the most privileged women in society are feeling by this sort of dominant culture. So that's that. What have critics said about the element that we might today call cultural appropriation in the poem? Well, there's been a mixed reaction particularly from Jewish critics. So I'm just quoting from a book written about Plath's life called "The Silent Woman: Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes" by Janet Malcolm, and Malcolm summarizes some of the critical reaction. Malcolm is a bit torn over how to think about Plath and admires some things about her but not others, and also identifies with her being a woman of a similar generation. And so she quotes some of the critics who have written. And so the late Irving Howe, who was a Jewish American critic, writes, "There is something monstrous, utterly disproportionate, when tangled emotions about one's father are deliberately compared with the historical fate of the European Jews. Something sad if the comparison is made spontaneously." So his judgment as a Jewish critic was that she has no right to this metaphor, that she has no right to this analogy, that it's just a pure appropriation of something that is not comparable. Another Jewish critic, George Steiner, liked the poem. He honors Plath for her act of identification, of total communion with those tortured and massacred. He writes of her as one of a number of young, so he's writing around the same time she's writing. He wrote of her as one of a number of young contemporary poets, novelists, and playwrights, themselves in no way implicated in the actual Holocaust, who have done most to counter the general inclination to forget the death camps, and he called Daddy one of the very few poems I know of in any language to come near the last horror. So he didn't see it as a troubling appropriation. He saw it as an affirmative and moving gesture of identification, that she saw in the oppression she felt an identification with other people who had been oppressed in different ways, but she could make an imaginative connection. And he says that she writes about the true horror of oppression in this way and should be honored for this, because she doesn't turn her face away from the horror of what went on in the middle of the 20th century. And so those, I think, are the two sort of poles you could have as a perspective on that. That it's just it's as Howe says, a monstrous appropriation to something to which she has no right, or as Steiner says, it is an honorable act of solidarity and identification. And I can't judge for you. I deliberately quote Irving Howe and George Steiner, both of whom as Jewish critics, I think both of their lives touched by the Holocaust, so I sort of grant them the right to judge, but they come to very divergent conclusions. And so I don't know if we can come to any conclusion on the ethics of this gesture in this class, but I thought I'd give you two. I think these are kind of the two most extreme reactions you can have to it. And so, but in any case, it is one of the most famous, oft-quoted American poems, and Plath is one of the most famous and oft-quoted American poets, because I think she stands in the American imagination in this role of the subversive, countercultural feminine speaking back to dominant masculine authority. And so there I will leave Sylvia Plath. Thanks very much and have a great day.